First, so I'm here to post about a dream that I've been having as of lately. I've been having the same dream, and the story is very simple. I am on my laptop at my desk, and my older sister is writing in her diary in her bed, and an extremely tall guy keeps trying to enter our room. He was literally so big that his chest touched the threshold, and I couldn't see his upper shoulder at all. My sister and I knew that he wouldn't be able to come in anyway, so we didn't care about anything and did our own things. He bumped his body trying to come in, then finally gave up a while later and went back. And at that moment, I woke up. But recently, he keeps cutting his body little by little. By the third day, he hadn't been able to come in, but the day before yesterday, he was in front of the door, standing with his ankles. He cut off his foot. Of course, he couldn't come in either, and just yesterday, he cut off half of his calves. His shoulder was seen for the first time, but he has also kept bumping against the door, and this time was no different. What happens to me next if he cuts himself all the way to his knees? Second, it's me again, and I came back to post my recent experience. 2 days later, my worries became a reality. I had a dream again that day, and this time he really cut himself to his knees. I'm not going to explain all the details, but all I could see was his abnormally big mouth, and he was smiling brightly. Then I woke up. I was too scared to go back to sleep after just seeing his face. After that, I gave up on sleeping for a couple of days. I drank all night with my friends, went to a handicraft workshop run by my mom. I was playing on my cell phone for a while and napped for a while, lying down on my mom's lap when I felt too tired. Then I fell asleep, shallowly, on the sofa, and the man was there in my dream as usual. Fortunately, I was able to wake up right away because I didn't sleep deeply. However, being scared, I called my aunt, who was interested in spiritual existence at that time. When I confessed that I was having a hard time because of this, she told me that she knew a shaman and asked me to go there with her. No one believed such a thing because my family were all sincere Christians. My aunt was also a Christian, but she took me to the shaman saying that the method would be much better than just praying. Well, I guess these poor little lambs must have been desperate. That day, when I went to see the shaman, she said this to us just as I went inside. When my aunt asked what I should do next, the shaman said, "I'll give you an amulet. Put it on your door." Because we don't know if he was just joking around or doing it for a reason, we have to give it a few more days. Then she continued, "After I came back home with the amulet, I put it on my door without my parents knowing. I fell asleep in my room comfortably for the first time, and there was the man in my dream as I expected, but this time he wasn't standing, just sitting by the door and staring at me. I was inwardly admiring the effect of the amulets when I saw him like that. Just then, he began to imitate my dad's voice. "Lord, please take care of my family and look after my lovely daughters as if they were your eyes." He said a prayer like that almost every day, and while laughing, the man just recited the exact same prayer with my dad. Tears flooded with fear, and whether he thought that it was funny to see me crying, he began to mimic the barking of my dog this time. It was just surprisingly the same. He would scratch the door and whine when I closed my door to study, and the man made the same sound, scratching his fingernails on the door. The next was the voice of my friends. The moment I heard his voice, I was so scared and creeped out. Eventually, I could wake up shortly afterwards while I was crying in my dream. I called my aunt right away, and we went back to the shaman again. And I think we have to raise our prayer to God and do some exorcism sooner or later. I have been awake since that day. Of course, I've been eating my meals normally, but I kept losing weight because of a lack of sleep. I was going crazy. I'm still terrified even when posting this right now. If anyone has experienced the same thing as me, please help me out.
My name is Mark, and this happened when I was 13 years old. It was a normal day in the morning, as usual. I was heading to school with some of my friends. We were just talking about several topics, such as school life or about the girls, you know. Then all of a sudden, I heard someone whispering. "Guys, did you hear that?" I asked, and one of my friends said, "Yeah, what the heck?" When I looked around, I realized that the voices were coming from the bushes, which were kind of far away from where we were standing. I ended up thinking that it might be some students who were trying to play pranks on somebody else. So we ignored them and walked toward the school. What a peaceful and boring day, I thought. Everything was going so normal until that incident. When we were in class, I suddenly heard another whisper under the window. I know that it was just a coincidence, but I started to get a weird feeling, thinking about the whispering from the bushes that I'd heard in the morning. However, I ignored it again, hoping it would be nothing. A few hours later, one of my friends got a stomach problem, so he had to go to the bathroom real badly. He got permission from the teacher and rushed to the bathroom in a hurry. However, he didn't come back for a long time, which was kind of weird. "Maybe he fell into the toilet," another friend next to me chuckled. About 5 minutes later, the teacher told me to go check to see what was wrong with him. I went to the bathroom alone, and when I was about to go in, I quickly smelled a terrible stench. Smells like blood. It was apparent that something was wrong. But then, I was being careless to find out what it was. I took one step inside and asked, "Dude, is everything okay?" But there was no answer in the restroom. I slowly started to open each of the stall doors, and then I found him, all bloody in the last stall. And I realized that he didn't have one foot. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was about to throw up. He was unconscious. His face looked pale, so I ran to the teacher and explained the situation. He ran to the office counselor, and they immediately called the police and an ambulance. After they had arrived, they took my friend to the hospital, and everybody had to stay inside. We all had feelings of anxiety. The cops searched the restroom, and they finally determined the perpetrator to be a serial killer who was wanted at the time. Then something came across my mind. I ran to the police and explained to them about whispers that I had heard in the woods and under the window. The police immediately went into the woods, searched the whole area extensively, and found a hut. To our surprise, they found another 4 corpses inside. After that, they still couldn't find the murderer, and this incident has left everybody in our town shivering in fear. And my friend eventually lost his ankle, but his life was saved though. I'm just glad that he was saved. And think about what would have happened to him if I hadn't gone to the bathroom to check on him.
I grew up in Bradford, Pennsylvania. Have any of you ever heard of Zippo lighters? They're from here. A thick forest surrounds the town, along with most of the neighborhoods. My family lives sort of on the outskirts of Bradford. Of course, much like the town itself, our house was also surrounded by forest. If you took in the scene from our back porch, you would see nothing but sprawling trees for miles. I tell you this so you can gain a sense of isolation. Out at my house, you could scream at the top of your lungs, and no one would come to help you. This happened back in the summer of 1996. I was 11 years old at the time. I had a childhood friend named Marty, who was the same age. Our fathers worked together and knew each other well. He would come over almost every Friday to hang out. Marty and I found ourselves hiking through the trees as we often did. However, we were feeling a bit daring and went further into the forest than we usually did. There was this barrier of trees that we would never go past, simply because I didn't know the area beyond that point. We continued past the barrier into uncharted territory. We eventually came upon a clearing. In the middle of this clearing was an old, disheveled-looking tent. Being the curious young men we were, we of course had to see inside. As we approached, I could feel the temperature around me drop. I'm no stranger to the cold, but this was in the middle of summer. Even at my age, I could sense that there was something truly sinister inside this tent. A part of me was screaming to hightail it out of there, but my own curiosity pushed me forward. We both stopped just outside the tent, and suddenly, we were both too frightened to move any further. We were both frozen in place, staring at the open flap of the tent as it swayed from side to side. The sky seemed to grow even darker since we discovered this tent, and though we were standing directly in front of it, we could not see inside. What happened next is the reason that I still struggle with alcoholism. A dark hand slowly emerged from the tent's opening. It reached out to us, with long black nails protruding out from its fingertips. I'm not ashamed to admit that I pissed myself out of fear. The hand slowly turned and made a beckoning gesture with its index finger, and that's when Marty and I heard a deep, bellowing laughter from inside the tent. I don't remember much about what happened after that. I just remember me and Marty running for our lives, tearing through the woods and back to my house. I do have a vague memory of me briefly looking behind me as I ran, to see a tall, dark, and human figure standing just outside the tent. Upon returning, Marty immediately called his mom to come pick him up. My mother asked us what was wrong, and we both explained to her that we saw some kind of creature in the forest. My mother ultimately dismissed our claims, but led us in a prayer while we waited for Marty's mom to arrive. Marty never came back after that, and we sort of drifted apart. Sadly, Marty began hanging out with the wrong crowd and began doing hardcore drugs when he was around 14. He ended up hanging himself in his bedroom when he was 17. As for myself, I suffered from severe night terrors that tormented me for years after that day in the woods. I'm not going to get into what I experienced in my nightmares, but I will say that I became an alcoholic as a result. After moving far away and attending numerous AA meetings, I'm glad to say that I've turned my life around, and I even have a family of my own. I still visit Bradford every now and again to check in on my aging parents. Whenever I'm there, I always set flowers on Marty's grave. I'm still convinced that what we saw that day in the woods contributed to his death. Now that I have some perspective, I think what Marty and I encountered was a demonic presence. It followed us home and proceeded to turn both of our lives upside down. There were rumors of people worshiping Satan out there in those woods around the mid to late 90s. Perhaps they awakened something, and Marty and I just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time.
This is a story that my friend actually experienced. My friend had a habit of sleeping with both arms stretching over his head as if he were doing a hurrah. One day he was sleeping in that same position as usual. However, suddenly he couldn't move his body. There was a big window by his bedside, and because it was summer, he was sleeping with the windows wide open. All of a sudden, he could see a woman through the window. Her face looked kind of weird, as if she wasn't a human at all. The woman with a creepy face pulled my friend's arm violently. At that moment, he saw her mouth had almost ripped up to her ears. She gave the most horrifying loud laugh when she pulled his arm, and my friend who was struggling was soon released from his sleep paralysis. When I came to my senses, there was a thick bruise on both of my arms, with handprints, he said. I live in the countryside, and there was a pretty famous reservoir in our area. One evening, one of my father's friends drove me home in a car, and we were just passing through that area. All of a sudden, a woman softly walking into the reservoir caught my eye. I couldn't see her face, but she had black clothing covering it, and she just went into the reservoir in the blink of an eye. My dad's friend next to me also saw the figure, and at that moment, neither of us could say anything. Then he stepped on the gas like a crazy man. After arriving home, he made sure I went inside the house and even said to me to not forget to check the door before I go to bed. Not long after, the broadcasting authorities came to the reservoir with some famous celebrities to shoot some kind of TV program. And seeing those celebrities falling into the reservoir somehow made me sick. I have no idea if the person I had seen that day was a person or a ghost. But after that, there are always 4 people who die there every year. When I was young, there was an accident where one of my older sister's classmates slipped on ice while playing and died of a concussion. Her friend's name was Billy. A few years later, my mom suddenly brought up the story about Billy to my sister while we were staying at home. Hey, do you guys remember the kid who died of a concussion? Your friend, Billy? Then I heard someone abruptly knocking on our front door. The apartment where I lived had a hallway with several houses side by side, but the hallway was kind of old, so the sound of people walking around outside seemed very loud. Furthermore, there wasn't a sign of anyone that day, but someone had just knocked on my door. My mom, my sister, and I stood at the back without saying anything to each other, thinking something was wrong. The constant knocking continued, and my mom finally answered. "Who is it?" Then someone from outside said, "Is Billy here? Is Billy here? Is Billy here?" It was a woman, and she asked these 3 same questions in a very dry voice. "No, he's not here." When my mom said it like this, it became quiet outside. And when I looked through the peephole, she was already gone. I couldn't even hear the sound of footsteps. To this day, I still wonder who she was.
I am an immigrant from Belarus. English is not my first language, so I apologize if I phrase things differently. Here's some backstory. I was only 11 when my family left the country after the collapse of the Soviet Union. My father was involved with the Communist Party and would frequently visit Moscow when I was a boy. I don't know all the details. I don't even know what exactly my father's role was in the USSR, but from what I understand, we were granted asylum in the United States and had to flee Belarus in 1991. But that's not really why I'm writing this story. This is about something I saw in my childhood that has scarred me for life. This took place roughly a year before we left, so I'm guessing the year was 1990. My family, like many others, lived in a massive apartment building in Minsk. There were 2 other identical apartment buildings adjacent to ours, and directly behind the buildings was a playground area where I would play with my friends Sasha and Victor. Beyond the playground was a section of trees that separated a shopping plaza from the apartment grounds. I remember that my mother was feeling ill and was bedridden, and my father was away on business in Moscow, so I was pretty much on my own that night. I remember that I had gotten bored watching TV in the living room and decided to go outside and see if any of my friends were at the playground. I would say this was around 8 p.m. and it was dark out. By then, most of the children were inside, and I don't even think anyone was allowed on the playground at that time, but I didn't care. There was no one around to tell me to go back inside, and I was pretty excited to have the playground all to myself. It was chilly out that night, but it was not snowing, so I figured that I would play on the slides and swing set until I either got bored or if security came along and told me to go back inside. So there I was, just swinging in the dark, when I heard something near the fence that separated the trees from the playground. There was a strange noise, like someone was sawing wood, but there was something just off about it. I ignored the sound, but it became louder as time passed, to the point where I became curious as to what was causing this strange noise. There were no lights at the playground itself, but there were lights mounted to the back of the apartment buildings that illuminated things just enough to where you could see your surroundings, but the trees beyond the fence were pitch black. I got off the swing set and approached the edge of the playground. The sound continued getting louder, even as I got up right to the fence. It wasn't until I let out a curious, "Hello?" that the noise ceased. I stood there staring into the dark trees, waiting for a response, but all remained silent. After about another minute passed, I innocently asked, "Why are you chopping down trees in the dark?" I then heard a shuffling from within the trees, and soon I saw a dark figure come into view, but did not step out from the tree line. What happened next is something that still makes me want to vomit out my insides. The dark figure then threw something. The object flew over the fence and hit me directly in the chest. I was knocked backwards, more out of surprise than the actual force of the impact. "Hey, why'd you do that?" I shouted, but before I could get another word out, I caught a glimpse of what had been thrown at me. A severed human arm was lying on the ground in front of me. I screamed at the top of my lungs and ran back towards the apartments, bawling my eyes out. I stormed into our apartment and sat on the living room couch to collect myself. I did think about waking my sick mother and telling her about what happened, but decided against it. To give you some perspective, my mother grew up in Siberia, and she could be quite ruthless at times. Not only would she not be too happy about being woken up, but she most likely wouldn't believe my story. And I probably wouldn't be able to sit down for a week if she found out I left the apartment alone after dark. So I kept this incident to myself. As a child, I understood that what happened was scary, but I had no grasp of the implications. I thought there was a monster in the woods who ate people who came out after dark. Now that I'm an adult, there are some things that I've come to realize. For our remaining time in Belarus, I never saw or heard any kind of investigation regarding a missing person or a mutilated body being discovered, which is nothing out of the ordinary living in Soviet society. The monster in the woods, hiding in the trees that night, was most likely a sadistic madman, dismembering a human body with a hacksaw. There is one more thing that I should mention. For the rest of the time that we lived there, I cannot for the life of me recall ever seeing my friend Sasha again after that night.
Last year, I had a classmate who didn't like to socialize. I was the only one who spoke to her. One day, she messaged me an article about cat abuse, knowing that I had a cat. I replied to her, saying, "Wow, that's literally insane." She then started pretending she was close to me and continued to send articles about cat abuse or pictures of dead, such as road-killed cats. Feeling uncomfortable, I slowly began to avoid her, and one day I suddenly felt like she took a picture of me. While she left her seat, I decided to secretly check her cell phone. Surprisingly, the phone was not locked, so I could easily enter her photo gallery, and then what I saw was horribly shocking. There were over 80 photos of me that I didn't even know she took. I got goosebumps when I saw the folder's name. It had my name, and there was one more folder, Cat, which contained pictures of dead bodies and the several articles that my friend had sent me. This story is about my friend's sister. The friend's family was living in a large apartment complex. One day, his sister went out, and this incident happened at that moment. Her ex-boyfriend, who was waiting for her, hit her on the head with a piece of sidewalk block and just killed her. The security ran towards them in surprise, but he ran away, went up to the roof of another apartment complex, and killed himself on the spot. After that, there were 2 memorial altars set up for both the woman and the man, and ironically, they were located right next to each other. And meanwhile, the bereaved family of the man insisted on this. They told my friend's family, "Let's join their souls in marriage." My friend's parents panicked, so they eventually fought with the bereaved family of the man, cursing at them. He told me later that everyone in the memorial altar went crazy that day. One of my teachers told us about a dream she had. She had a dream about 3 or 4 years after her grandfather passed away. In her dream, it was raining hard, and her grandfather, who completely got wet, tried to pass his socks to my teacher. Even though she loved him very much, she kept refusing because she didn't want to receive them for some reason. Then suddenly, the view abruptly changed, and my teacher was in the car. She was driving through a very big tunnel. At some point, she started dozing off, pressed on the brake, and then woke up. She thought it was just a strange dream at first. Another day, she was driving in a car with her husband. She usually doesn't sleep when she's in the car, but she started dozing off in the front passenger seat on that day. When she woke up, she found that the place they were passing through was the same big tunnel she saw in her dream, and her husband was falling asleep next to her as well. Being startled, she immediately woke her husband up, and they returned home safely. She suddenly remembered her dream, so she visited an expert to get any advice on dream interpretation. And the story goes like this. When you receive an item from a person who passed away, then you will die. Anyway, my teacher soon forgot about it for several years, until 7 years had passed. That day was the day they were going to change the place of her grandfather's grave, and the moment when they opened his coffin, they could see his wet body was floating in water. The strange thing was that the flesh had not yet rotted. She could see that the body had a bit of volume. She ended up thinking that her grandfather, who had been standing in the rain in a dream, might have wanted her to know of his current condition. However, this wasn't the only surprise. It turned out that it wasn't only her. Other relatives had the same dream. This isn't a scary story, but I've been the clumsy type ever since I was a child, so accidents used to happen a lot. And once I almost died. I was the girl who really loved animals, so without thinking, I walked onto a road where cars were moving crazy fast. I didn't put much thought into the things I did when I was a child. However, as soon as I stepped in, I heard several voices coming from behind me.
Watch out!
Surprised, I fell backward and fortunately wasn't on the road. But when I looked back, there was no one behind me. My big brother was there, and with a tearful voice he said, "Hey, what if you got hurt? You shouldn't let go of my hand." My brother came out of the store and ran towards me right away. So that must mean that my brother was the only one who called out to me at that moment. However, I then heard dozens of people calling out to me, yelling, "Watch out." Not long ago, the movie theater I was at was crowded with people when the movie Parasite came out. Maybe it was because that film just won a big prize called the Palme d'Or. There were a lot of people in the theater even though it was daytime on a weekday. So I entered the theater a little late that day, and the other people had already sat down in their seats. The seat I picked at that time was somewhere in the middle, probably the 8th row from the center of the screen in the front. Anyway, after the movie began, all I could hear was someone's breathing next to me. I was watching it in a relatively quiet atmosphere, as this movie was for adults, but suddenly, something strange under the screen caught my eye. The space between the front of the screen and the first row of seats is usually carpeted and empty. And there, I had no idea whether it was a woman or a man, but the person with disheveled hair was crawling on the floor on all fours. He was wriggling on the floor, attaching his stomach. At that moment, I thought that someone might have fallen there or was hurt at first. So I looked around with anxiety, but to my surprise, none of those people showed any response. What is it? Is he drunk? Is that why they're ignoring him? I could see that no one around me reacted, so I was also unable to move. And in the middle of the movie, there was a scene where one of the family members broke into the house after another family had left, and they started to drink alcohol and eat food in the living room. The sound of rain was so vivid, and all of a sudden, that unknown thing suddenly raised its head straight up in the air. He had been dragging his whole body to the floor until a moment ago. However, he then stood, waist up, straightened his chest, and started to look around the seats like crazy. I don't know if he saw me or just around me, but he turned his head towards where I was sitting. At that moment, me and that thing were looking at each other. Because of its messy hair, its eyes were blinded, and I could only see around its nose and mouth. As soon as I saw it, a thought suddenly came to my mind. Is that a human? Feeling uncomfortable, I intentionally turned my eyes towards the screen to avoid it. And this time, it looked up with its face and started to stare at the audience from under the center of the screen. On the wall under the screen, it was now completely standing straight with its upper body visible and looking right this way. I couldn't see his face well because of his hair, but soon after, it was finally shown, reflected by the light coming out of the projector. Only then did I begin to see a little bit of the middle of its face, and it was laughing, almost tearing its mouth, and its eyes were abnormally big and wide. I almost screamed for the first time. Its face was so gross that I almost threw up at that moment. So I picked up my bag quickly and started running down the stairs, thinking I should leave the cinema as soon as possible. I looked towards the screen as I went down the stairs, and it was staring at me, turning its head slightly. The movie theaters usually have different locations between the entrance and the exit. I guess they locked the exit, which was close to the seats until the end of the movie. No matter how hard I tried, it didn't open. Even though it was such a crowded place, it was like I was trapped. I could have come out through the entrance, but I was not in my right mind at that moment. But just then, I knew instinctively that something was wrong. It was approaching my back. What should I do now? I then turned around with my eyes closed and ran frantically from the exit to the opposite entrance. Fortunately, the entrance door was open. When I came out, I could see the audience waiting and the part-timers in front of me. And as soon as I came out the main street from the theater, the creepy sensation quickly disappeared. However, whenever I saw videos relating to parasites on TV or the internet, its smiling face under the screen of the theater came up in my mind and distressed me, and I eventually couldn't watch that movie at all after that. When I was in elementary school, I had a friend who lived right next door. We used to go to school together all the time. One day, I was standing in front of my friend's house waiting for her as usual, and I realized that she was kind of strange when she came out. She looked kind of bemused. When I looked more closely, she was breaking out in a cold sweat. Feeling something strange, I asked my friend what was going on, and she started telling me a story about her dream. She started to dream the same dream she had from long ago. A kind-looking old lady always comes out in her dreams, and she cooks meals for her and then she eats it all. My friend had a lot of conversations with her because she gave her such a good impression. The most amazing thing was when she woke up. She felt full, as if she had actually eaten, even though it was just a dream. My friend lived alone with her maternal grandmother at the time, but on another day when my friend was about to go to school, she repeatedly requested one thing from her with a scary face. "Do not follow the stranger or anyone today, okay? Do not." My friend was confused for a moment, but reassured her grandmother, telling her not to worry, and then went to school. However, nothing happened all day. And that night, she fell asleep, and the old lady appeared in her dream as usual, and made her a meal. She was enjoying her meal, and all of a sudden, the old lady asked my friend to go somewhere with her. She held the old lady's hand and tried to follow her thoughtlessly. However, she then remembered what her grandmother said to her in the morning, so she let go of her hand and refused to go. Then she saw her face turn scary at that moment. The old lady suddenly grabbed the back of my friend's neck and began to drag her somewhere, and no matter how hard she tried to escape, she wouldn't budge at all. While she was trembling with fear, she then remembered the other thing that her grandmother had told her in the morning. "If you're dragged by someone in your dreams, don't panic. Just slam your head against somewhere, like a wall or a pillar. Then you will wake up from your dream. Understand?" My friend, who remembered the advice, saw a tree in front of her and tried to hit her head, but suddenly, the old lady laughed as she pulled my friend's head. "Who taught you this?" "Oh, I see. Your grandmother did." So she failed to wake up and was being dragged away from her dream. And the old lady's cane suddenly caught her eye. At that moment, she bumped her head with all her strength on the stick, and then finally woke up from her dream. I got goosebumps listening to my friend, since it was early in the morning. Anyway, my friend, who had been absent-minded all day, started skipping school the following day. I was worried about her, so I went to her house, but the door didn't open, and she didn't answer the phone. A month later, my friend called me, and she asked me to come over to her house. With curiosity, I ran to her house, and when I saw her again, she looked emaciated, and the atmosphere around her was quite different. Most of all, she kept laughing to herself like crazy. She dragged me into the house, took me to a room, and said this: "Hey, you see my granny? She's crazy." Then she began to giggle more, and I unconsciously turned my eyes to the room. Her grandmother, looking into the air continuously, was begging desperately in a small, tiny room without a beam of light. Her face seemed afraid of something, and she kept muttering the same words. "I didn't teach her. That was not me. Please, I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Later, I heard that her grandmother had passed away shortly after, and my friend has been hospitalized because of the shock. Come to think of it now, wasn't the food she always ate in her dreams a meal for her grandmother, who would die soon?
About 10 years ago, my family had a studio rental business in a big city. Our studio had the most thorough security system at that time. So, as a result, our studio became the best place for those parents who ever wanted to send their daughter from the rural area to the city. Even though the rent price was highly expensive, our studio was always traded, and because of that, the gender ratio of women was far higher. At that time, there was a woman who had moved into our studio for about 3 months. She was the kind of annoying type that she requested changing the automatic door lock's password several times a month. There was a manual in the room that helps you to change the password for oneself, but she kept asking us to do it every time, saying that it was complicated. We felt like she was the type who was going to fuss about our studio someday, so we always did her favor whenever she asked. But one day, she started saying something strange. She said that someone seemed to be coming inside of her room when she wasn't there. Of course, we have a master card to enter every room, but I swear, we are not those ignorant types of owners who come in and go out of any room, except for sometimes when people who leave their rooms without telling us they had changed the password, or when we had to do an electrical inspection for the empty rooms, asking for prior consent already. But she seemed to doubt me, because I was the one who guarded the studio during my university vacation. Anyway, my parents sent her back to her room kindly, saying that she might be mistaken at first. Then the other day, she came up angrily this time. She said that she put a piece of paper in the crack of the door and folded the edge of the bed's blanket slightly when she went out. However, when she came back again, then she found that the paper was fallen on the ground and the blanket was all spread out. Cursing me tremendously, she had already believed 100% that I was certainly the criminal. At the time, I was ordering food and in a good mood after cleaning the roof in a heavy sweat, and this woman's behavior slowly pissed me off. And even my parents seemed to be suspicious of me at this point. But I couldn't confirm what was happening on each floor because there was only one CCTV in the front door and another one in the parking lot at that time. No matter how I felt the unfairness, I couldn't just install all the CCTV using a huge sum of money to capture the evidence of the woman who has such a megalomania and mythomania. So I put a digital camera that had very low resolution at that time in a beverage box and put it in a hallway where she was living. I had to go down every 2 hours and empty the memory, and I finally ended up thinking that I wouldn't be able to do this anymore after about 3 days. On the 4th day, the incident happened. That day, the police knocked on our door first. Following them, when I looked inside the woman's room, I could see the pearl-like eyeshadow was spread on every side of the walls. It turned out that the woman had coated the doorknob with cosmetics when she went down to her hometown for a few days, hoping the criminal to leave a trace when he broke into her room. But as if he were mocking her, the criminal had put those pearl shadows all over the walls, ceilings, and even floors of the room. So the police came to my room after receiving the woman's report. They started to investigate whether they could find any traces of pearl shadow on my keyboard, mouse, drawer handle, faucet, and even the toilet watering lever. But it was nonsense. I was just eating delivery food without knowing anything. The wash basin in the woman's room, which had been empty for 4 days, was completely wet, as if someone had just finished taking a shower, and I could see the soap was expanded. I was eventually called to the police station as a witness for questioning. When I finally got back home, I brought my camera that I had installed before to see what was on it, just in case. And then, something strange was caught in the camera. On the second night around 11 p.m., the woman's boyfriend was filmed entering that empty room. He wasn't in the video for the 3rd day, and of course I couldn't film it for the 4th day. It was a suspicious thing. In the end, I went to the police station again with my camera and submitted it. The whole story of the incident that was revealed later was like this. It was her boyfriend who made her terrorized and tremble in an attempt to bring her into his studio. While she went to college, he kept sneaking into her room and left those suspicious traces for a month. Then, as his girlfriend noticed the strangeness, she told him what had happened, and he kept telling her about the cruel and scary murdering cases that occurred in a studio apartment. Later, he suggested to her that she could sleep in his house if she was scared. His final goal was cohabitating with the woman, and the climax happened on that day. After hearing that she had set up a trap at the door, he entered her room and rubbed the pearl shadows on the whole room more than she did. Of course, the sink, the blanket, and the paper between the doors, everything was all by him. He thought that if his girlfriend felt extreme fear, she would end up living with him. What was even more creepy was that when the police came to our studio that day, he was comforting his girlfriend calmly, hugging her in his arms. The more she got afraid, the more courteously that bastard consoled her, and kept thinking about how he could make her scared on the other hand. In the end, the man was accused by the woman and her family, and the woman took time off from school due to the huge shock. There's something I want to confess about, so I'm going to write it down on this anonymous site. I'd like to talk about one thing I really did wrong. When I was in elementary school, I had to ride my bike to school because there was some distance from my house to my school. My house was located in a back alley. And one day on my way home, I was riding my bike around the curve, and I couldn't slow down, so I ran over an old lady. She collapsed, passing out, and I rushed back to my house, being terrified. She was a very kind person in my town. She was close to my family and people in the neighborhood, so she always greeted me kindly whenever she saw me. Back then, the CCTVs weren't installed around on the streets, so no matter what happened in the alley, there was no way to find out who did it. And the next day, a handwritten poster was attached to the alley wall. "We're finding a witness. My grandmother had an accident. We don't want to believe it, but if the criminal is one of our neighbors, please confess. We don't want strong punishment either. We just want to resolve the injustice." It was written something like this. She returned home shortly after being treated for a concussion, and after that, her health began to deteriorate rapidly because she was quite an old lady. I was afraid that I'd be revealed that I did it, but she didn't seem to remember the incident. Or was she just pretending that she couldn't remember? Anyway, she was always spending time in the same place, enjoying the wind or the sun, and I had to avoid that place where she was. I shouldn't say it like this, but fortunately, I wasn't caught. As time went by, my guilt gradually became dull, and I was living without much thought of it. When I was in high school, she had dementia. And one other day, I was passing by the alley, and I met the old lady again. I greeted her unconsciously. I'm not sure if she had a clear mind or not, but anyway, she smiled at me and said like this, "Oh, hello. So you don't ride your bike anymore?" The cold sweat soaked my back in a brief moment. Without answering, I just ran away, and time passed. The old lady passed away after I became an adult, and there's still the guilt in the corner of my heart. Since I can't tell this story to anyone, I hope you guys understand me using the power of anonymity to write it here. I know, I'm just the most terrible trash in the world.
My family is a small farm here in Kirkwood, upstate New York. We grow a few veggies, keep a few chickens, nothing too spectacular, but it's home and we love it. But a little while ago, back in early 2019, we got woken up by something in the middle of the night that scared the absolute life out of us. We have this big front yard with flower beds and a big lawn, and that's where we keep the chickens and the dog too. So me, my mom, and my dad were all sleeping one night when we were woken up by this huge crash in the front yard. I can hear our dog barking really loud and violently before there's like this yelping sound from it and he goes quiet. I walk out into the hallway and see my dad storming out of my parents' bedroom, rushing down the stairs to get his shotgun. Me and my mom were about to follow him outside to get a look at whatever was going on, but he yells at us to call the cops, stay inside, and not follow him under any circumstances. My dad grabs the phone and I rush back into my bedroom to watch from the window. As soon as I look out, I see this car that's smashed through the fence of our yard and torn up a section of our lawn. It's obviously really dark out, and the car's headlights are only lighting up a section of our yard, so I can't really see much outside of the beams. But I do see something that absolutely breaks my heart. It's our dog, lying on the front lawn, not moving at all. He looked really hurt. Something had really messed him up. But given that he was barking after the actual smash of the car, it couldn't have been the impact that hurt him so bad. Something else entirely. What I saw next was only because my dad had this little light attached to the end of his shotgun. He starts shining it around the front yard as I hear my mom calling 911 in the hallway, telling them that something horrible had happened at our address and for them to come as quickly as they could. Then my dad shines the shotgun light over towards the chicken coop, and I saw something that I continue to see in my nightmares for a long time to come. It was a man, completely naked from head to toe, kneeling among torn-out feathers and broken bodies, and he was sinking his teeth into the flesh of a still-living chicken that he held tight in his grip. Every time he bit into the chicken, it would flap and shake, making the most awful screeching noises as he tore more raw flesh from its body. My dad racked a shell into the chamber and started screaming at the guy to get out of the chicken coop. But the guy barely listens at first, just carries on ripping this big brown chicken apart with his bare hands and teeth. And by the time he does actually start listening to my dad, God, it was horrible. He looked right into the light of the shotgun so that his face was perfectly lit up, and he smiled. There was blood and feathers all over his face and chin. He looked monstrous, totally insane, eyes bulging out of their sockets. I think even to this day it's probably the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. I started banging on the window and begging my dad to come back inside. I was so scared the guy was going to attack him or something, and if he did, that Dad would shoot him. And I know it's maybe a little lame of me, but I just didn't want to see any of that. I was already distraught from seeing our dog just lying there all lifeless on the lawn, and I know I wouldn't be able to handle it if anything had happened to my dad. Luckily, the guy didn't bother doing anything to my dad at first. I think he was just so blinded by the light of the shotgun that he just sort of stared into the flashlight, hypnotized by it for a few seconds. But he soon rose up off of his knees, that bloody, twitching chicken still in his grip, and started to make a move towards my dad. As soon as he did, the sound of Dad's shotgun rang out as he fired a shot above the guy's head. But the guy hardly flinched. That's when I realized he must have been on some kind of drug or something, maybe meth or PCP or whatever. He didn't seem scared at all by the fact that he'd almost had his head blown off, but it was definitely enough to put him off from straight up attacking my dad. He just carried on smiling though, kneeling back down among the chickens as he carried on ripping them apart. It felt like an hour before I finally saw the red and blue flashing lights of the cop cars coming down the road. But from what I learned later, it was only a couple of minutes before they actually arrived, since they happened to have a unit in the area already down highway patrol. When they arrested the guy, he got really crazy, and they had to actually use their tasers, which had little effect at first, and pepper spray on the guy just to get him on the ground. We later found out that the guy, named John Many, was actually from Florida, that there had been a manhunt for him, and he'd somehow gotten all the way up to New York State using stolen cars and hiding himself away in trucks. We weren't the only place he'd attacked either, since he actually killed another dog on a different farm, maybe less than 2 miles away from us. That was definitely the most terrifying thing I'd ever woken up to in the middle of the night, by a long shot too. Thankfully, our dog survived.
This story took place months ago. I had a friend. Let me just call his name as Cheese while I'm telling this story. So whenever Cheese and I got bored in those days, we usually went to the forest to discover new routes and places near our houses. Sometimes we reached a gated property and we entered the property through the forest. It was so much fun to see that the security guard didn't know that we were coming in and going out. However, this incident changed everything, and we never went to another place since that day. One day it was kind of late on that day and we were riding our bike as usual. The sky got darker and darker and we passed through the forest, bushes, and unpaved roads. The forest was so thick that we could hardly see any source of light. Thanks to my mom, she had told me to take my phone with me, and I could move forward, turning on the flashlight. Then, all of a sudden, we heard a rustling noise in the bushes. We stopped and both turned our eyes to it. Cheese stared at me with shivering eyes and said, "Hey, why don't we just go back?" I don't know what gave me the courage to say, "But we're almost halfway, I guess. Let's go forward." So we began to move again, riding our bike. But Cheese suddenly stopped, and I could see the frightened look on his face. I also stopped at the spot and looked where his eyes were headed. Something was in front of us. My mouth was wide open when I saw an old man standing alone and muttering something. We couldn't hear anything, but we could read his lip movements in the bright light of the fire he set around. Then Cheese pointed his finger at something. I noticed that something was wrong. There were someone's skulls forming a circle around him. You can't imagine how I got terrified at that time. It was impossible for us to run away because the old man was blocking our way. He slowly turned his body toward us and said something like this.
"We need some more sacrifice."
Then he pulled out his pocket knife and ran toward us. I knew I had to think fast. Screaming, I took my helmet off and threw it at his face, and Cheese grabbed a big stone on the road and threw it at him at the same time. He dodged my helmet, but fortunately the stone got him accurately. He hit his head hard by the stone and fell down on the road. And we turned our cycles back and drove off as fast as we could without looking back. The next day we checked that same place, but neither the man nor the circle of skulls remained. We've kept this story secret, but to this day I always think of the same thing. What would have happened to me if Cheese hadn't have thrown that stone at the old man? Who was he, and what was he doing? I have no idea.
When I was 9, I was staying home alone. It was early morning, and I had just gotten out of the shower and brushed my teeth. I put on my favorite outfit, set up a little area in the living room with a drink and a snack, and then turned on the TV to watch something. The phone rang. I went across the house to go answer it. The voice on the other end was, well, really familiar and really comforting for me. He asked me about my day so far, and he made small talk. After about a minute or so, he then said,
"I like your outfit. Is pink your favorite color?"
I replied back with, "Oh, thank you. No, it isn't."
"What were you planning on watching on TV?"
he asked. It took me a few seconds to understand what was happening, as I was only 9 years old and very naive. The voice on the other end of the phone then changed. It became deep and raspy and horrific. The voice then proceeded to describe all these horrible things that they wanted to do to me, and in detail. I went numb. My skin felt as if it were on fire, and my heart was racing. I had never been more terrified in my entire life. I slammed down the phone, and then I called my mom at work. I tried to explain what happened, and I'm not sure I was making much sense. She got on to me for answering the phone, and she told me to go back about my day. I remember trying to explain to her that he was watching me, and that he told me what I had been doing, and that he knew what I was wearing. I also mentioned that I was going to call 911 because I needed help. "That isn't necessary. I'm not coming home. Just don't answer the phone and go watch TV," she said, and then I hung up. I was really confused and I was scared. I could feel his eyes on me. I pulled the curtains closed and I raced around the house, torn between doing what I felt was right and doing what I had been told by my mother. This whole time the phone was ringing. The second it would stop, it would just start up yet again. The sound of the phone ringing would pulse through my entire body like electricity. It was practically paralyzing me. It was like I was frozen but also on fire at the same time. I waited for a pause in the ringing and called 911. "I'm home by myself and I'm 9 years old and someone's watching me and telling me they're going to kill me," I told the operator. She tried to keep me calm and she said that she would send help for me. I remember standing there listening to this kind voice just trying to help me, but I could feel every scary movie scenario just playing out behind me. Was he creeping up behind me with a knife? Was he going to shoot me through a window? Was he going to throw a rock through the glass and open the door? I just didn't know. I couldn't breathe and I couldn't feel my body. In a moment of panic, I set off the alarm to the house and ran outside. I remember this sense of relief, but also this overwhelming feeling of having a separation in my reality. The house felt small and dark and really dangerous and cold. Outside felt open, as well as safe and warm. I could hear lawnmowers and the sounds of birds chirping. It was a beautiful break from that bone-chilling feeling of the phone. It was like I was watching a movie and I could see myself experience both of these environments at the same time. A neighbor was pushing his child in a swing. He was concerned. He let me stand next to him and he protected me. I could hear the sirens now, the blaring sound getting louder as they grew closer. It felt like it took an eternity, but the police finally arrived. An officer walked over to me and he asked me what happened. I did my best to explain it, but so many of the words on the phone that were used were just so embarrassing. I couldn't bring myself to use such adult words to a police officer. And his other words were just bone-chilling. I couldn't say those either. To this day, I can still hear my young voice repeating the words. He was watching me. He said he was going to kill me. Not long after, my mom's car pulled into the driveway. She, for some reason, decided to come home. She didn't look for me or come to speak to me. She just calmly got out and then walked over to the police officer. I was standing in the doorway from the house to the garage just facing the driveway. I could see my mom and the police officer. I was watching and trying to understand, trying to figure out what was happening. Then I saw it. She was laughing. My face was swollen from tears, my heart still racing, and my skin was on fire. And my mom was laughing? What the hell was going on? Very slowly, I crept a little closer, and I then overheard. I'm so sorry about this. I guess she just got scared being home alone and overreacted. I'm really sorry. What the hell's happening? What did I do wrong? Did I imagine this? Was this a dream? Should I not have called 911? Did I actually overreact? My memory of what happened after that is a little hazy. I remember refusing to stay home alone and the sound of the phone ringing just rippling through my body. It wasn't something I liked discussing. I refused to repeat what had been said to me by the voice on the phone. My mom decided that she knew who did it, but she didn't even know the details. There was no investigation. No one was questioned. She told me it was a boy who was the same age as me who lived across the street. I knew that was impossible, but no matter how much I protested it, I was always told that it was him. Many years later, after I was an adult with my own children, we were at Christmas. Everyone was in the living room and I had gone into the back bedroom to change a diaper. As I was walking out of the room and back into the living room, I could hear my mom laughing, her voice as if she had been telling a joke. The faces of everyone else in the room told a different story. Discomfort, anguish, shock, fear. Yet she was still laughing. It felt as if I was walking in slow motion. One of my older children had actually stopped me from entering the living room and sort of pushed me back into the room that I had just come out of. She just told the story of you being home alone and the man threatening to kill you. She told it like it was a joke or something, like some funny story from your childhood. My child told me. To this day, I never learned who it was that called me. I deal with my fear of ringing phones and phone conversations on a daily basis. It's awful.
아직도 기다려 널 call